University of Alberta's Faculty of Law. And I would like to welcome you to an online panel discussion on fiscal federalism in the wake of Alberta's equalization referendum. Today's discussion is being hosted by the Center for Constitutional Studies at the University of Alberta. The center is located in Edmonton on Treaty 6 territory. And I would like to begin by acknowledging the ancestors, traditions, and the spirit that drew First Nations peoples, the Cree, Blackfoot, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Saulteaux, Inuit, Métis, and then settlers to this gathering place. We at the university are grateful for the many benefits that we received as a result of the treaty, which was signed in 1876. I'm delighted today to be joined by three panelists who have extremely distinguished records of public service at the federal, provincial, and municipal level in Canada. Howard Anglin is a lawyer who's currently doing postgraduate research in constitutional law at Oxford University. You can see the Bodleian Library in the background. Howard served in a number of roles in the office of Prime Minister Stephen Harper, including acting chief of staff, and was principal secretary to Alberta Premier Jason Kenney from 2019 to 2020. Gordon Campbell was the leader of the BC Liberal Party from 1993 to 2011 and Premier of British Columbia from 2001 to 2011. Prior to entering provincial politics, Gordon served as mayor of Vancouver from 1986 to 1993. From 2011 to 2016, he was Canadian High Commissioner to the United Kingdom. And last but not least, Andrew Petter is President Emeritus of Simon Fraser University and Associate Counsel to Arve Finlay LLP. From 1991 to 2001, he was an NDP member of the British Columbia Legislature and held numerous cabinet portfolios, including Attorney General, Finance, and Intergovernmental Relations. Andrew was Dean of Law at the University of Victoria before joining Simon Fraser University in 2010, where he served as president until 2020. So welcome to all of you, and thank you for joining us today. I would also like to thank the members of our audience and let you know that if you have questions for the panel, you can ask them by using the question button at the bottom of your screen. If you see somebody else's question, you can also move it up the list of priorities by clicking on it in case we run short of time. By way of background, on October 18th, 2021, the province of Alberta held a referendum on equalization in conjunction with municipal elections. The referendum question was apparently straightforward. Should Section 36, subsection 2 of the Constitution Act 1982, Parliament and the Government of Canada's commitment to the principle of making equalization payments be removed from the Constitution? Just over 1 million Albertans voted in the referendum, nearly 40% of Alberta's 2.8 million registered voters. Of those who participated, not quite 62% voted yes, just over 38% voted no, and just under 5% submitted blank or invalid ballots. Today, we want to discuss what this referendum result means for Alberta and for Canada. But of equal importance, we want to place this discussion within the broader context of how fiscal federalism in Canada works and what strains these arrangements place on our federal system of government. I'll be asking the panel to address three overarching issues. First, is there presently an imbalance between revenue raising capacity and spending responsibility among Canadian governments? And if so, what challenges does that imbalance present for Canadian federalism? Secondly, does the apparent lack of constitutional constraint on the federal spending power create problems for the balance between federal and provincial power in Canadian federalism? And if so, what mechanisms are available to address these problems? And finally, what impact will the Alberta Equalization referendum have on the way equalization and Canadian fiscal federalism more generally are likely to evolve? So let's begin with the area of fiscal imbalance. And this idea was explored in a book entitled Fiscal Federalism and Equalization Policy in Canada, written by Andre Lacour and a number of other academics. And they argued that in a federation that was properly balanced, the revenue raising capacity of each level of government would be equal to the jurisdictional responsibilities of that level of government. They went on to argue that Canada is fiscally imbalanced in two senses. There's a vertical imbalance because the federal government has too much revenue raising capacity relative to its areas of constitutional responsibility, and the provinces have too little revenue raising capacity relative to their areas of constitutional responsibility, notably healthcare, education, and most social services. There's also a horizontal imbalance in the sense that some provinces have significantly greater revenue raising capacity than others. So let me begin by asking the panel if you agree with the underlying premise that a government's revenue raising capacity should be equivalent to its jurisdictional responsibilities. And let's start with you, Gordon.
Well, I think, first of all, we should be thinking about taxpayers as well as governments. But secondly, I do think that once we've had that first discussion, I think obviously we need to make sure that governments that have responsibilities have the fiscal resources to meet those responsibilities. And one of the challenges we face in Canada is that that is not the case. This is an ongoing kind of never-ending story and never-ending discussion about where we take the money. It's all the same taxpayer. The provincial governments could actually, I do think, they could tax far, far more, but there's not really a necessity to do that if the federal government would just stop interfering with what the provinces are doing, allow for the innovations that take place that the provinces would like to try, which is one of the smart things about the federation, I think. But I think there is just clearly a fiscal imbalance between the federal and provincial government. And one of the things that we miss out when we often have constitutional discussions is how much the world has changed since we wrote the first Constitution. Everyone says, oh yeah, that's 1867, that's a long time ago. Well, 1982 was quite a long time ago now too. It's 4 decades ago. And the world has changed just so dramatically since that time. In 1867, when the Constitution was first put together, about 3% of the people lived in urban centers. Today, it's over 80% of the people in urban centers. So governments tend to spend time trying to get resources from other levels of government to meet the needs they have at the local level where the services are required. And so if I think there is an imbalance. I think it's a significant imbalance. And I think we spend a lot of time, effort, and energy trying to right that imbalance when I think there's some fundamentals that we have to examine first and change to reflect the 21st century Canada, not the 19th century Canada.
So Andrew, let me turn the question over to you. And Gordon's already sort of raised the issue of whether or not there is a fiscal imbalance. Would you agree with his analysis that there is a vertical fiscal imbalance in Canada at the moment?
I would. I'll resist the word vertical because I still believe there are two sovereign realms of government in this country, not one above the other, but coordinate. But yes, I think there is a serious imbalance. I think Gordon has described it well. In 1867, areas like education and health and municipal affairs, for that matter, social services, which were assigned to the provinces, were not areas in which governments were really heavily involved at the provincial level, and they were given to the provinces at that time. Clearly, those are areas that command resources now, and there is certainly an imbalance in terms of the fiscal capacity of provinces to address those areas on their own without gaining support from the federal government, and that causes all sorts of problems I'm sure we're going to get into. But you don't have to take it from Gordon and me. Look at the Parliamentary Budget Officer and the analysis the Parliamentary Budget Officer has done, which shows that in terms of debt to GDP ratios, the federal government is in a fairly good state of finances. The provinces are not, and it's going to get worse. This gap is going to get worse over time, and it's going to become a more pressing problem over time if we want our provincial governments to be able to address the social needs that they're responsible for.
So Zara, perhaps I could ask you to put up that Parliamentary Budget Office slide and ask Andrew just to walk us through it.
Well, if you look at it, what you see is over time, the subnational governments, which is code word for provinces, their debt to GDP ratio is going to become one of increasing debt relative to GDP. If you look at the federal government line, the blue line, and extend it out over the projection of the dotted blue line, what you see is the federal government's trajectory is downward. In other words, it is reducing the amount of debt relative to GDP to a point where it could eliminate it over time based on current jurisdictional expectations and the Parliament Budget Officer's projections. That's not a good situation. That's a situation which suggests that the tensions that are going to exist around fiscal imbalance are going to become worse over time, not better, unless something is done to address them. If nothing is done to address them, then we can expect that some of the problems surrounding federal spending that are the subject matter of this discussion will become worse.
So Howard, let me ask you to comment on this set of issues. And you're our one panelist who has significant experience at both the senior federal level and the senior provincial level. So you've seen this this movie from both sides of the camera. How do you see the fiscal imbalance situation?
Well, I will adopt Andrew's language of coordinate imbalance. I also agree that as the Alberta Court of Appeal said, I think in the carbon tax reference case, that the federal government's not the parent and the provinces aren't the children in Confederation. They are coordinate. So yes, there's definitely a vertical imbalance, coordinate imbalance, but I would say it's an accidental imbalance that has become an entrenched and dubious constitutional practice. And the main reason for this is that the federal government, or the main reason that the federal government can distribute federal funding to the provinces, is because it collects taxes for them at the same time that it collects taxes for its own jurisdictional work. But the fact that Ottawa collects the taxes for matters beyond its jurisdiction is a matter of convenience. It should not be a matter of constitutional import. And it certainly should not be turned into an excuse for treating the money that the federal government then gives back to the provinces as federal money. The taxes collected by the federal government that are not spent on federal matters and that are not part of the equalization payments should be returned to the provinces in the amounts equal to what those provinces paid. Otherwise, I think over time, and we've seen this, all transfer programs become informal equalization programs. So in recent years, for example, in Alberta, Alberta's paid a net $20 billion more to the federal government than it's received back, but only $3 billion of that is equalization. So we've created these sort of informal equalization programs, and I think in the interest of transparency, we should be making clear what is equalization and what is not, even if that means actually having to adjust equalization somehow. I think that would begin the process of actually being able to see what the federal government is spending on federal programs, what the provinces should be spending on provincial programs, and we could actually go from there. I have thoughts about horizontal imbalances as well, but we haven't got onto that. So
we will shortly, but
Yeah.
I did want to ask Andrew and then Gordon to weigh in a little bit more on how this fiscal imbalance came about. Because one can argue that in 1867, the fact that the federal government had indirect taxation power and the provinces didn't, meant that constitutionally the federal government had a much more significant capacity to raise revenue than the provincial governments, and its spending responsibilities arguably were greater. But nowadays, indirect taxation makes up a pretty small percentage of tax revenue, and provinces and the federal government equally have access to direct taxation. So why is it that we find ourselves in this imbalanced situation? So Andrew, let me throw it to you. And
well, I think if you go back to the, I'm going to go back a fair ways, but if you go back to the war period, the Second World War period, the federal government occupied significant tax room that previously would have been assumed to be provincial in order to fund the war effort. And coming out of the war, the federal government had a choice to either return that tax room or to utilize it for social purposes. And they chose to utilize it for social purposes. In fact, there's an interesting debate amongst different reports. The Green Book proposals basically said that it should be returned, and the Ralph Surwa Commission said that it should be used for social purposes. And obviously, it was convenient for federal politicians who wanted to demonstrate their commitment to certain social objectives to utilize it for that purpose. And then they occupied, as Howard said, they occupied the tax room, but they occupied it not to fulfill matters within their own constitutional jurisdiction, but rather to support and promote matters that were beyond their constitutional jurisdiction. And no doubt the national commitment around the war effort provided them support for doing that at that time. And that situation has perpetuated. So we now have the federal government collecting significant amount of tax dollars and returning it to provinces, but subject to certain conditions that have waxed and waned, but for purposes that are outside the federal competence. And that is a situation which the federal government has been loath to give up. It's almost self-perpetuating because the federal government is seen now, for example, to have constitutional authority over health matters. It is looked to assert that authority, and it becomes self-perpetuating to some extent. There have been efforts in the 1990s through the Social Union Framework Agreement to try to untangle this and correct it. But I must say, as the lead minister for the province in those negotiations, the provincial effort to try to restore to a more principled approach was undermined when the federal government waved some more dollars in front of provincial premiers. The Canadian Health social transfer payments were increased, and the provinces backed off, and we got a rather weak form of social union framework agreement, much weaker than the one that I'd hoped to achieve at the time. So that's a bit of the history, probably too much of the history than you wanted to, Phil.
No, it's precisely what I'm looking for, and Gordon, perhaps as a former provincial premier, you can weigh in on that comment on federal dollars being waved in front of provincial premiers and the temptations that creates.
I'll just say they should have done what Andrew said. That's all I should say. You know, I think one of the things about this is here's what happened. Change happened, and it kept on happening, and it's going to keep on happening. And it's going to continue to add to the imbalance, I believe, that takes place. Because when, you know, right now every province is strapped for healthcare dollars. Guess what? 20 years ago, when I was elected premier, every province was strapped for healthcare dollars. Guess what? When Andrew was in the cabinet, my bet is the province felt strapped for healthcare dollars. Health is a provincial responsibility. The feds have imposed themselves on it. I think, frankly, the federal imposition of healthcare with dollars has been something that's held our healthcare system back. There are different healthcare systems, obviously, in the 10 provinces. We can all learn from one another. There's different access to healthcare in Quebec than there is in Alberta or British Columbia or Newfoundland and Labrador. You know, I think we have to sort of start from it and think, well, let's see, I think it was the First World War that we had a temporary tax that was brought in to reflect the challenges of the First World War. It was called the income tax. Now, how many citizens do you think that thought that was going to be temporary? probably more in 1917 or 1918 when it was brought in than would think so today. There are very few citizens that believe in temporary taxes anymore, in my experience. But so change happened. And then, as Andrew says, change happens in the Second World War. And we have there are times, and I think there's a limited number of times, which I think we should sort of confront, where Canadians come together and say there is a larger federal initiative that can be taken. But that's kind of a specific time, reflecting specific changes. We now have situations where, I think it's a political decision. Now, I was involved in politics. I think it's important. I think the choices are important. But I think that too often we allow politicians to say, this is what everyone's decided, when everyone hasn't decided that at all. I think there's a question in my mind, at least, is when was it that you can specifically point to where Canadians said, we will allow institutions to decide what's going to happen with our healthcare? When did they give up the right to take care, to have some control over their healthcare? And was it explicit? I don't think it was. But we have, at any rate, we have an increasing challenges of health. We know these challenges are there in aging and healthcare, mental health, the opioid crisis, they just pile up. And we still talk about, well, how do we distribute revenue? Which is actually different than how do you solve the problem, I think, in some cases. And I think when the federal government steps in and says, we don't like your provincial solution, whether it's in Saskatchewan or New Brunswick or British Columbia, when they say we don't like it and we're withholding money from your services, that creates a real stress and a real problem. And I think the stress leads to sort of eventually it will break. And that's not something that I think that we should be looking for. We should try to figure out how we reinforce what was really accountability to begin with. I'll go back just quickly, not just to healthcare, but just go back quickly to municipals. Municipalities were squeezed in between asylums and mental institutions in the Constitution in 1867. Well, they're a little more important in people's lives today than we think. We have the Prime Minister saying he's going to solve a housing problem when he's not going to solve a housing problem. He's not going to be able to solve it from the federal level. That happens at the local level. And there's an awful lot of work that's got to be done to solve it at the local level, but they don't have resources. So they come to the province and say, can you help us do it? Then they go to the feds and say, can you help us do it? And you know what? We've been talking about that one for 40 years now, too. Since about 1968, we've been trying to figure out how we deal with the housing crisis. And we have discussions about it. But there's a problem, joint accountability is no accountability. Who's accountable for doing those things? Who's accountable for delivering healthcare to people in the way they need it in their lives? I would say it was the provinces. The feds evidently don't agree with that. Others may disagree with the feds and me or the provincial level, but I do think those are real discussions we have to have, or we're going to constantly have the pressure of dealing by conference about the problems that we face, as opposed to dealing on the ground about solving the problems.
So Howard, you mentioned the horizontal imbalance idea, and I wonder if you could expand on that a little bit, because that's obviously one of the themes of the Equalization referendum is this idea of the federal government redistributing money from one provincial set of taxpayers to the taxpayers of different province.
I absolutely will. Can I just follow up on one thing, though, that just because we've all been in violent agreement so far on almost everything, I would like to introduce one area of disagreement, although it's not my area. And that is, in some of these cases, the provinces are to blame. And what I mean is, I remember always being shocked when I would sit around the table as the plus one in Council of the Federation meetings or First Minister's meetings with the Prime Minister and the premiers. How many premiers asked explicitly for strings to be attached to federal funding? They didn't want the accountability. And the reason they would give is, particularly in healthcare, if you just give us money, it will be eaten up in labor negotiations. Whereas if you say this is for mental health or this is for long-term care, then we can go to the unions and say, you can't have this money. And I was always shocked by that. I mean, that just seemed to me an abdication of political responsibility. But the federal government's not the only player who's at fault here sometimes.
I think so. I'll just interrupt for a second. I totally agree with you, but I do think that that's, I mean, I can't remember doing that, but I think that, if others did, that's fine. But the fact of the matter is we shouldn't.
Right. I
Again,
agree.
accountability is no accountability. It should simply be said, this is what's happening. Thank you, federal government. Stay out if we have to. Or
And
thank
to
you.
perpetuate the violent agreement amongst us, I mean, the lack of accountability that this promotes is very much in politicians' interests. I mean, provincial governments that aren't delivering what people want in healthcare can point to the federal government and say it's all because the federal government hasn't paid for it. The federal government can turn around and say it's because the province isn't using the money wisely, and the poor voter is left perplexed and not knowing which government to hold accountable. So in many ways, this does serve politicians' interests in a way that is quite destructive and counterproductive to good public policy.
Absolutely. I mean, the fundamental principle of accountability is that power has to flow with responsibility. In this case, power is fiscal capacity. So any deviation from that, I think, is a distortion of accountability mechanisms in our democracy here. So, okay, we're back to agreement. On horizontal imbalances, I don't think that there's a significant, well, equalization is intended to deal with this. And as a result, I don't think that there's a significant problem right now. But I would get back to the idea that we've moved away from having equalization be about providing equal fiscal capacity to provide, I think as the Constitution says, reasonably comparable levels of public services at reasonably comparable levels of taxation. I think we've gotten away from that by allowing the principle of equalization to creep into virtually every area of federal transfers. And I think everybody would be well served, the public most particularly, but maybe not politicians in their political interest, but politicians as they should think about these things. I think everybody would be well served about clarity and transparency as to what is equalization and what isn't. And in the areas where there's no equalization, then there should be much more freedom for the provinces to use that money to, as Gordon says, experiment with different means of delivery of social services.
Andrew, did you have a point that you wanted to
raise?
Yeah,
I guess what I wanted to say is I don't see equalization as an expression of the federal spending power. I think equalization can be justified on different bases by the federal government. We could get into, Phil, you and I could get into constitutional tests under national dimensions and that kind of thing. But I think it's a distinct exercise by the federal government of a capacity that the provinces don't have the capacity. And I think equalization obviously has been contentious from time to time, but I guess my view is that equalization is part of the bargain of confederation and part of what keeps the country together, but it only will be seen as such and supported as such if the other elements are also functioning well, which means that there is an alignment between fiscal capacity and responsibility. And the one thing we haven't talked about, where we may have some disagreement amongst us, is constitutional inflexibility. Because I do think if we are going to talk about how are we going to align jurisdiction with fiscal capacity, we shouldn't think just about transferring the resources that the federal government can command to the provinces. We should also think about the possibility of transferring jurisdictional responsibility to the federal government. I'll give you one example that's near and dear to my heart, and that's support for students. Support for student in the form of student aid, I think we most effectively delivered through a form of conditional transfer, which with taxation, conditional grants that would claw back through taxation. Given the amount of mobility across this country, that can't be done by provinces, and I think a strong case can be made to give jurisdiction for the federal government over the creation of a conditional grant kind of program nationally. So I think we should be thinking about fiscal alignment, not just as transferring money to provinces, but also about jurisdiction. And part of the problem, of course, is that our Constitution is so inflexible. I mean, probably the least flexible Constitution of any federation in the world, that it makes that kind of alignment impossible or very, very difficult at the same time as we're trying to reconcile capacity with fiscal capacity with jurisdiction.
So somewhat controversially, some people might say the fix to the problem of fiscal imbalance is the federal spending power. Now, we could argue that the federal spending power is not the fix, it's actually the problem. But I want to explore that because there have been a couple of academic commentators who have criticized the idea of the federal government being able to spend money in areas of provincial responsibility. One of them is here with us today, Andrew Petter. Another was a University of Montreal a law professor named Pierre Elliott Trudeau. And it seems that Prime Minister Trudeau was much more comfortable with federal spending power than Professor Trudeau was. So, Andrew, I'd like you to explore a little bit your thinking about what's wrong with the way we have traditionally thought about the federal spending power, which is the federal government can spend money however it wants, and it can attach conditions to its spending in areas of provincial responsibility.
Well, we'll leave aside the legal arguments, which have been kind of overtaken by Supreme Court decisions that have ultimately upheld the federal spending power, despite efforts to suggest that is inconsistent with the Constitution. In terms of the principles, the problems, we've already kind of discussed them. I mean, the whole idea of a federation is to maximize the capacity for democratic decision-making by assigning certain responsibilities to electors within regions so that they can determine for themselves how best they want that region to pursue that policy. And that means that there's more scope for them to have their preferences expressed at the regional level than they would if their votes were submerged within a national polity. And the spending power undermines that to a considerable extent. Of course, part of giving that power to that democratic power to people within regions is also to encourage, as Gordon said, experimentation and creativity, to allow different models to emerge and for the best models to hopefully be recommended to other jurisdictions. And over time, we'll see an improvement across the country by virtue of that experimentation. So at a fundamental level, the whole purpose of federalism, which is to allow that democratic decision-making to exist at a local level, is compromised, contaminated by giving the federal government the power to exercise coercion on those policies through national initiative. And the other problem we've already talked about again is accountability. To the extent that we want to promote democratic decision-making, we want politicians to be held accountable for their decisions. It's very hard to hold a politician accountable for a decision if the public doesn't know who's responsible. If the provincial minister can say, well, I would have done it perfectly, but for the fact that the federal government took the money and didn't give enough of it back, then that weakens the ability to hold that politician accountable. And conversely, if the federal government is wading in on areas where it doesn't have jurisdictional responsibility, can only use spending as an instrument, it doesn't make it possible for the federal government to thoroughly assert its capacity on behalf of the public. So it can say, well, we only have the spending power. We could only go so far, or we could only afford so much. So it fundamentally undermines accountability throughout the country, whether you think more power should go to the federal government or go to the province. The fact that it's intermingled in this way with the federal government having only one instrument to use, but one that it does use to compromise provincial jurisdiction in areas that are assigned under the Constitution to the province, has a very deleterious effect on democracy in both of the ways that I've tried to describe.
So, Howard, I'd like you to comment a bit on why you think that the orthodox view of the federal spending power, the one that Andrew says has, and I agree with him, has been upheld by the Supreme Court of Canada, has prevailed against the argument that an unfettered federal spending power really creates accountability challenges at both the federal and provincial level.
Oh gosh, you're probably all more familiar with why it's happened, but I certainly agree it's a real problem. I mean, we've ended up with what I call a mendicant federalism, where the 13 premiers go with their begging bowls to Ottawa to accept whatever scraps Ottawa will provide each year, along with whatever conditions Ottawa sees fit to impose. And I think that this is a real affront to our constitutional system, which from even before Canada was united and before the British North America Act, recognized the existence of significant regional difference. I mean, difference has been part of our makeup as a country from the beginning, and the Constitution is supposed to recognize that. And yes, that allows for experimentation, but also allows for different provinces to just take different approaches that reflect the different needs or wants or circumstances of their people. That's how the democratic principle works. And what Andrew was describing is sort of something close to the idea of subsidiarity as expressed in Pope Pius XI's 1931 encyclical Quadragesimo Anno. And that is a moral principle. It's a principle that that allows for the development of a society through the actions and decisions of its own people, and that is best achieved by people who are closer to the people who are being governed. And so when the federal government, for example, I was speaking to a group of people in Ottawa, and I ran these were the ultimate Ottawa insider group. And I just kept running into this problem of Ottawa knows best. And it was in the Q&A, one of the audience members challenged me on my criticism of the strings that were attached to the recent federal childcare program. And she said, but Canada's needed a childcare program for decades, and we finally have one only because Trudeau forced it on the provinces. Implicit in this was Canada needs a federal childcare program of the kind that Trudeau imposed and of the kind that this woman clearly wants. What wasn't recognized is that every province has a Department of Child Services. Every province has a child care plan or program or child care services of some kind. It may not be what the federal government wants or what this woman wanted, but there's no government that doesn't have hundreds, if not thousands, of civil servants working on child services at any given time. And this view from Ottawa that if they're not doing it, then nobody's doing it, I think is absolutely pernicious. And I think that's probably behind why this has become so entrenched. They really don't respect the right, let alone the ability, let alone the right of the provinces to make these decisions, so that, for example, with the childcare program, yes, more money may have been useful for the provinces. Every province, I think, would happily take that money to improve child services, but they might do it in different ways. They might support more informal childcare. They might allow greater parental leave. They might allow give more money to families to allow them to choose whether they want one or both parents to stay at home more or work from home more in the modern environment. I mean, there were all sorts of more money to support extended families and community care, all sorts of models that different provinces would have wanted to do. And they, of course, as what Andrew, I think, said or was alluding to, those are the provinces that are actually delivering the services. And they're the ones that have to be held accountable for the services they're delivering. And if those services are being dictated from Ottawa, it breaks down that principle of democratic accountability. I think this Ottawa knows best why the Supreme Court upheld it. Say you're more familiar with the case law, probably because there's nothing actually explicit in the Constitution that would allow the Supreme Court to strike it down. Although it seems quite happy to follow the arguments of the institutional or constitutional architecture in other areas. I don't know why it wouldn't here. But whatever the reason is that the courts upheld it, it is a real problem. It's not getting better. It's hurt when some premiers play along with it. And it's not going to stop until you have a federal government that recognizes it. And if I can make a small plug for the government I worked for in Ottawa, under the Harper government, we really tried. We certainly weren't perfect, but we really tried to give money to provinces with fewer and fewer strings. And I think it was disappointing to see how few provinces actually took that opportunity to experiment. And maybe that's because they were afraid the next government 2 years later would punish them for it. But that was my experience.
We have a question. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I just wanted to say on both those last two, Andrew, and in both the presentations, is that First of all, I'm going to say upfront, which will be a disagreement. I don't think equalization works. I think it's a word that people don't have trouble fighting with. And so, you need a PhD in something or other to figure out exactly what the equalization payments are going to be. And I think, it's absolutely correct that, it just spreads across everything. So I personally don't think there's a province in Canada that's a quotes have not province. I think provinces in Canada make policy decisions that have a direct impact on the resources they have available to deliver public services. We never take that into consideration. It strikes me that we have a great deal of difficulty recognizing how huge Canada is. Canada is not Britain or France. British Columbia is the size of Britain, France, and Germany combined. This is a big, big country. So I think the initial points Andrew was making, the Constitution was about, yes, finding unity, but it was also about recognizing the diversity of the geography, the people, the provinces that were part of making it happen. And that's still the case today. There are big, big differences between provinces that are a reflection of their geography. So we have to be careful that we don't have these headline labels that we use and then say, okay, let's go off and do that, equalization. So I'm going to give you one example which really irked me. When I was first premier, everyone was talking about fiscal imbalance. British Columbia, when I was elected, was quotes because somebody decided by some formula they were have not. We were never have not. We were always British Columbia. We always had resources. We always had people. We always had opportunity in front of us, and we could make our own decisions. And that was important to us as we move forward. And I think that one of the things that really irked me was premiers would come and say, oh, well, there's so much fiscal imbalance. And I remember, well, it's about an equalization of services across the country. And, the angels would sing and the harps would play. It was just marvelous, right? And there was a major change in the federal equalization program. And one of the provinces got a significant amount of new resources. The next week, it wasn't even a month. The next week, it wasn't about providing better services. It wasn't about providing equal services. The people of that province got over $1 billion in income tax cuts. That's not about equalization. I get the political advantage for the government of the day who was doing it, but for British Columbians, they probably could have taken their $130 million and used that. And I'll give you one other example to go back. Is Prime Minister Harper created, I think it was called the Community Development Program. And it was $1 billion program, which meant British Columbia would get roughly 130 million. So the money came and I said to him, I don't want the money. I want you to give the money directly to the Union of BC municipalities. They can make all those municipal decisions they want. I don't have time to make their municipal decisions. They can be accountable for it. They loved it in the municipalities. Another premier said, you don't give any money to municipalities. I want it all here. I'll decide what's going to happen. Right? So those things happen all the time. And one of the reasons they happen is this is a huge country, right? With great diversity. And so to go back to what Andrew was saying, yes, we reflected that. Yes, the Constitution should be a unifying document, but if people think they're getting taken to the cleaners on it, it becomes a document that pushes us apart as opposed to pulling us together. And I think that's the huge challenge that we face. Subsidiarity is, for me, that was a buzzword when I was still involved in this stuff. That makes nothing but sense. It says, yes, we're going to have the decisions made where they're closest to the people that are affected by it, and you move up. There's lots of stuff for the federal government to do, but they should do it well. And one of the ways that you can tell whether you're doing it well is look at what your Auditor General says. Your Auditor General is saying the federal government is not delivering what we're asking them to deliver well. So, we should be paying attention to those things, get that right at the federal level, let the provinces get it right at the provincial level, and find a new mechanism that makes sure that the municipalities get the resources they need to start solving the problems that they face every single day on the street. And we can do that, but we have to be willing to change to do it.
I wanted to go to the first question that we have from the audience, and I pose it to you, Andrew, because it boiled down, it essentially says, well, why aren't there legal mechanisms to put constraints on federal spending? We have legal mechanisms to constrain federal incursions into provincial regulatory jurisdiction or provincial incursions into federal regulatory jurisdiction. Why don't we do the same thing in relation to spending?
Well, I think, I think that the Constitution arguably that did put constraints. I mean, the notion that spending is somehow a different activity that doesn't have to observe the division of powers is a very artificial one. I mean, we say there's a division of powers for regulatory authority, but apparently spending is free of that division of powers. However, I think the reason the courts have not gone down that road is because it would have been in the post-war period, as the federal government built up these programs, it would have been highly disruptive, and probably the courts were reluctant to entertain that notion. The Supreme Court of Canada is also a national institution, no doubt influenced by a national mind think, and may well have thought that that there should be a national role. I do think going forward, I mean, there have been attempts to try to place constraints. The Social Union Framework Agreement, which I referred to earlier, was an attempt at one point with a high degree of provincial unanimity to place some quasi-legal constraints on the federal government, but it kind of got blown apart by the government of the day that decided that it didn't want to live with those kind of constraints and found a way to modify and water down that agreement. But I do want to say this. I think there's a corollary between constitutional inflexibility and federal spending. And this is where we may have a disagreement across the panel, not about that principle, but about its implications. Because just as it is the case that areas that were assigned to the provinces that did not have an expectation of significant government presence at the time of Confederation, like health, like education, for example, or social services, just as the expectations have changed with respect to the role of government in those areas, I think the expectations have changed with respect to which order of government is perhaps most appropriate to deliver those services. And I think there are some areas that are within provincial jurisdiction that if you were to poll Canadians, the Canadians might well say that given the choice, they would prefer them to be under federal jurisdiction. So there isn't that option. And the spending power is really the only safety valve that's there to try to express the fact that there may be a desire on the part of the national polity, national electors, to have a national policy, but it can't be achieved through constitutional amendment. So it's achieved with all the dysfunctionality and imperfection and perverse implications that we've talked about, but it's achieved through the spending power. And that expression of spending power may be a usurpation by the federal government of constitutional authority, but it may also be a reflection of national sentiments that have built up around areas in which people now think of these areas with a national political consciousness more than a local political consciousness. And I think our failure to have a constitution that allows for that kind of discussion to take place, to be seen as realistic, ends up validating the use of the spending power. And I obviously think that's unfortunate.
We have a question from my colleague Malcolm Lavoie, and he says that in US constitutional jurisprudence, Congress's spending power is limited by a requirement that Congress cannot coerce states to implement federal policies. Is a standard along those lines workable in Canada, or is there another better approach to policing the spending power? Howard, do you have any thoughts on that?
Malcolm's certainly more up to date on American constitutional law than I am. I haven't really followed it closely for the last decade or so. But even there, the federal government gets away with all sorts of coercion, or what I would consider coercion, and the nudging, tugging at state policy. So I'm not sure if it works at best imperfectly there. I don't think it could work here. Putting on just a strictly legal realist hat, no Supreme Court in Canada is going to be the court who strikes down the Canada Health Act. They're just not. So if you don't, and the Canada Health Act is probably the most obvious example of federal intrusion on provincial jurisdiction, and also federal coercion through very clear mechanisms that are actually built into the statute. or were built in over time. So that's just not going to happen. Going back to what Andrew noted about some areas of Canadian social policy that there may be a national consensus or now national issues that should be transferred. I would resist even that. I think even that's going to run roughshod over the provinces where there's a clear consensus that these areas are not national. If you told Albertans that Justin Trudeau is going to take over the healthcare system, like there would be riots in the streets of, well, at least Grand Prairie and Lethbridge and Mesenhat and Red Deer, maybe not where you are in Edmonton, but everywhere else. I mean, it's so the difficulty in changing the Constitution in those extreme regards are there for a reason, because not everybody agrees.
I also
Gordon,
think
go ahead.
I think it's really dangerous to take the American constitutional experience and say we can use it in Canada. It's just not the same. There's no, that's a nice talking point, but it's the fact of the matter, it's not the same. The people with the power have got to be willing to change the situation. And I think, frankly, we're locked right now. And I think we have to find a way we unlock it, because the tyranny of the status quo exists. And, think of how many hours are spent in workarounds to the status quo. I was premier for about 10 years. I went to 10 federal provincial conferences. There are areas where you might get 7 provinces to agree, but not 10. It's very seldom that you get 10. And frankly, if anyone who's ever paid attention to the Council of the Federation or Premier's conferences that it used to be called, there's always an asterisk. There's always an asterisk on those things, except for Quebec, right? So, I can't think of a time when there wasn't, let's put it that way. And you have the meetings at the meetings. So you do the meetings and everyone's talking like this amongst themselves. And yes, this makes sense. I can remember one particular who went and everyone agreed. And yes, we all agreed and everything was there except for the asterisk. And we got out. And as soon as the question went to one of the premiers, he says, well, I don't really agree with that. And then, there goes your consensus. So one of the big myths of Canada is if we just have the premiers and the prime minister sit down, we can come to a resolution. It's way more difficult than that. And that's why we have to open the Constitution up to allow for some flexibility, because with flexibility, you'll find unity. If you try to lock it in, I think you're going to watch, the kind of thing that we have taking place right now in the country.
So I'd like us to turn our attention a bit to the actual referendum itself, because my sense was that part of the thinking of Premier Kenney and his colleagues was to try to do something that might help jar the status quo or at least open up the possibility of some kinds of flexibility. It was interesting to me that after the referendum, Premier Kenney made some statements to the effect that the referendum was not designed to lead to the abolition of equalization, but to give Alberta leverage in negotiations concerning fiscal federalism. Howard, I don't know if you feel comfortable addressing this, but what kind of leverage do you think Premier Kenney was talking about in those sorts of remarks?
Right. I think he's probably referring to the fact that the referendum was a flashpoint. It was a way of focusing public attention on what was really a much bigger issue, which was, particularly at the time, we're talking about 2019 when the pledge was probably made during the election, and then 2020, right after that 2019 federal election. I haven't been in Alberta for the last year, so I don't know how sentiment may have changed, although it seems like some of the anger is being redirected in other directions, including at the Premier himself. But there was real frustration there. Poll after poll was showing consistent 25 to 30% support for separation and over 50% sympathy for the idea. And the one thing people sort of understand, I don't think they actually understand it or think they understand, is equalization, which was stood in for a whole host of other measures that were deemed to be unfair. The full $20 billion in transfers that the province was still making, despite having been in effectively well, if not quite a recession, serious economic downturn since 2014 at that point. Even at the same time that the federal government and a couple of provinces, BC to some degree, and certainly Quebec, were actively obstructing the province's ability to promote its economic recovery by getting energy to world markets. So this idea that you're going to be taking our money, you're going to be blocking our chance to improve our economic situation, it was real anger. And the equalization, I think, referendum was an outlet for that. And I think outlets are important in politics. I'd rather channel anger through political avenues than outside them. And it was the visible part of a bigger campaign, which was everything from going to Parliament in person to take on Bill C-48, which is the tanker ban, and C-69, the new economic assessment law, which the Alberta Court of Appeals just held was unconstitutional, and engage with the federal government on a whole host of issues. And so it was the symbol of a much bigger campaign, and that campaign did pay some dividends. One part of it was the Fiscal Stabilization program was opened up. I don't think any Canadians and Albertans had really heard of that, but it was sort of offered as an alternative. It was like saying, we're angry about this. This referendum is showing how angry we are, but if you can't do that, you can do these things for us. And so the province got $400 million from the Fiscal Stabilization program. It got $1 billion for orphan well remediation that had to be extracted with great difficulty from the federal government. And the province got some breaks on some federal regulations in which they agreed to recognize Alberta's regulatory system on things like methane, which would have ended up costing the province and its businesses billions of dollars over the next few years. So it was the visible part, and much mocked and maligned sometimes as being constitutionally illiterate. But I think politically it made sense. And I think if it wasn't wholly successful, that overall campaign was at least successful in part.
So, Andrew, I'd like to ask you to comment on the idea of the referendum as not so much being about what it said it was about, but part of a larger strategy of relations with the federal government. I don't want to mischaracterize what Howard was saying, but I think I'd be interested in your view of the referendum as something about a broader set of concerns than what the specific text of the referendum said.
Yeah, well, the fact that the Constitution is so rigid and so difficult to amend does create opportunities for political theater by proposing constitutional amendments that have little chance of success, but have some resonance politically. And I take it, I think Jason Kenney clearly knows that the difficulties associated with amending the Constitution, unless he were talking about some extra constitutional measures, which I don't believe he was. I think what he was trying to do was send a strong signal about the level of dissatisfaction within Alberta towards the federal government and Alberta's standing at a time where it was under significant economic pressure relative to the rest of Canada. And the feeling that Alberta no doubt had in terms of natural resource policy, for example, that other provinces were at odds with it. This was a way, I take it, and I'm not really as close to it as Howard or as knowledgeable as you, Phil, and I'm sure Gordon's much more up to speed with it, but that's how I certainly saw it. This was a way of sending a very strong signal and getting the public to express itself in support of that signal that hopefully would produce some political response or maybe avert negative political actions going forward. I guess if anything, I was surprised that the referendum didn't get more support than it did. And I don't know quite how people read that, but I think the expectation may have been that it would garner even more support. And so it could have been counterproductive to the extent that the support wasn't quite as overwhelming as many expected. But I think the Constitution does provide this opportunity to use constitutional amendment proposals that have little chance of proceeding, but as a mechanism for expressing strong discontent and trying to mobilize the public around that.
I would just, sorry, if I'd add one thing in there. I think everything you said, I agree with. I think it was a lower result, and I think than expected. I think if you'd held the referendum the day after the 2019 federal election, it would be about 90%. I think that reflected the relative unpopularity of the UCP government at the time. But I would also note that the alternative that was being asked for was a referendum on independence. So in that sense, this was a compromise that, as speaking as a federalist, it could have been worse in that sense.
Well, that's a really good point. I mean, and here, so the argument may be that the political theater had two purposes. One was to express the discontent, but also to channel it into a forum that was less potentially dangerous than the one that would otherwise have been dominant in the conversation.
There's two things that struck me from this. First is it's a way of noticing. What Alberta was doing was putting up their hand and saying, excuse me, hello, we're over here in Alberta. You should think about us for a bit, right? And I don't know about Andrew, but, and you know, we can talk about 62%, is that good or bad? I kind of would have liked the 62% vote in an awful lot of the stuff that we're trying to do politically. So it's all very well to say, yeah, well, they didn't get 80. Well, they got 62%, right? And the other thing is they engaged people in it, at least enough to go and vote. I noticed one of the things was, the comment was how low the voter turnout is. Well, I ran municipally. The voter turnout is typically pretty low, right? So it is a way of engaging. It's a way of putting it in. And I'm going to just say one more thing, which is a little bit, maybe it's naive, I'm not sure, but I think it says, show some mutual respect for us. The rest of you guys, let's have some mutual respect here for what's going on. And if we can't figure out a way through that, then we're going to be in a lot more trouble than we think. But I do think that was important. I think it was, you know, more power. How else do we engage people? I can tell you there's not 3.2 million people listening into this conversation today. No. So at least we had some people who took the time to say, thought about this and cast a vote. That should be a message. How people use that message will really be up to them.
One of our questioners asked, you know, what we thought of the split in the referendum result, and Howard, maybe I can throw that question over to you. The sort of roughly 60-40 split what was your impression of the significance of that?
I think it's what I said earlier. I think if you'd held it in 2019, it would have been higher. And I think we've had higher turnout. There was more anger directed at the federal government at the time. Can you remind me of the date of the?
It was October 2021.
October 2021, right. So at that point, you're post beginning of the pandemic. Federal government's handing out large amounts of money. Provinces are trying to work productively with the federal government. I think that that took the anger off the boil for a bit, and that probably brought it down a bit, both in terms of the turnout and the vote split. And as I said, I think the provincial government at the time was far less popular than it had been when the referendum was promised. And I think all those things together probably brought it down by 10-15% at least, if not a lot more.
Andrew, your thoughts on that sort of 60-40?
I just want to add, because 2021, of course, is the first year, according to Trevor Tombe, in decades that Alberta actually received more money from the federal government than it paid in. And that's as a result of the massive pandemic spending. So ironically, the referendum was being held at the time when it was probably least applicable. Although we're back to normal again, I think, in 2022.
Well, I don't disagree with Gordon that 60% is something I would have appreciated getting in my own elections, having scraped through twice. But politics is all about expectations. And I think when Premier Kenney called the referendum, the expectation was it would be higher, and for reasons that Howard's well explained, it wasn't. I guess the only other thing I would add is it was designed, I think, not only to send a message to the federal government, but this is sort of, I think, what Howard was intimating. It was sending a message to the electorate that the premier got it, that the premier understood the level of dissatisfaction, particularly within his own ranks, and was prepared to do something about it, but found a way to do something that was within bounds constitutionally. I guess that didn't work out too well either in light of recent events, but it was clearly designed with that in mind.
So bearing in mind recent events, and because this is recorded, people may not be remembering that Premier Kenney announced last week that he would be stepping down as premier once the UCP selected a new leader. Do you see anything happening with the referendum result now that Premier Kenney won't be the person who's bringing it forward? Or do you see it as something that other politicians of whatever stripe in Alberta might well want to carry forward? And if so, in what way? Howard, do you want to try that one?
Me? Gosh, trying to think of all the things I can't say.
Oh, say it, Howard. Go ahead.
No. Look, I remember at the time. I remember a week or so after the election in 2019, when the UCP government was elected, Premier Kenney flew to Ottawa to meet with Trudeau and with Parliament, and I was with him. And I have a lot of friends still in Ottawa, particularly journalists and people in the political sphere. And I just kept hearing from them, why is Kenney fanning the flames of separatism? Why is Kenney fanning the flames? Why is he feeding the anger? This was the received wisdom, I think, across Canada, outside of Alberta and Saskatchewan, probably, maybe Manitoba, that Kenney was riding this wave and he tried to explain, and I don't think anybody actually believed us, but they may get a chance to see what the alternative is now, that he was channeling the anger. The anger was real. And you just had to be at some of these town halls. It was particularly, again, it's not the whole province, it's not the whole area, but remember, you are more attuned to your own voting base, and the voting base at that point, if there was 30% separatist sentiment, it was like 50% in the voting base then of the UCP. So that could not be ignored. Premier Kenney refused to even countenance independence or separatism. And in that, he was probably too principled for his own political good at times, but he would not have it any other way. And I, working for him, wouldn't have had it any other way. I think depending on who wins the leadership, you may get a chance to see what how the alternative would play out, what it looks like when people actually do stoke separatist sentiment and do feed the anger machine. Now, it's always a fine line. I mean, are there things that Premier Kenney may have said that he regretted at times? Possibly. I don't think any politician couldn't say that. But I mean, passing few, really. I think a lot of people, particularly outside Alberta, heard what they thought he was saying and didn't actually listen to what he was saying within the context that he was speaking, usually. But there are other voices out there that are far less compromising, and I think will be no more productive at the end of the day in actually extracting any benefits from Ottawa. So,
Gordon, your thoughts on where you see the Alberta equalization reference playing out as the country evolves?
Well, I think that, Howard is the one that can tell you what benefits they got out of it, and they did get some financial benefits, clearly. But, I think there is, you've heard me say this before, there's tyranny of the status quo that is just pretty overwhelming. And so for someone to even put up their hand and say, excuse me, we could do this differently, there is an immediate rush of people to say, oh, no, you can't do this differently. Or the classic, the coverall is, we can't touch the Constitution. Well, we can touch the Constitution. It will be a lot of work to touch the Constitution. People have touched the Constitutions a number of times since 1867 when it was passed, even since 1982. It's evolving. And I do think that one of the really critical things is that we have to encourage even provincial governments to speak clearly for their provincial government, for their provincial jurisdiction. This is what we would like to do. This is how we think we can help meet the needs. But I don't have a lot of hope right now, to be truly, brutally candid about it. I don't have a lot of hope that the federal government is going to be responsive or flexible. I'll go back to one of my favorites, which is healthcare, right? And the federal government actually stops innovation from taking place. It's threatening for some reason to them. And we have to get over that. So I take my hat off to Kenny for saying, well, why don't we try this? At least it's a constructive step that you can take. And again, I'll go back. It engages people. One of the things that, people like me who like public policy, people are feeling very pushed away from public policy. They don't feel the connection to them anymore. They feel the cost, but not the benefits of it. And I think I think we have to really work to find a new sort of inventory of benefits that people can see in Canada, in being part of Canada. And it's not always getting money from the federal government. It's not always getting something from someone else. It's been given the opportunity to create the public environment you want in your jurisdiction. It's finding ways to do that will work so people feel connected. And in Alberta, when the referendum was put out, I will guarantee you, I wasn't living in Alberta at the time, they felt disconnected. They felt like, who cares about us? We're not putting up with it anymore. So I don't disagree with Andrew that expectations make a difference. But when you get 62%, when something that wasn't a huge issue by the time it got to the polls, right? That's a big number. That's a signal. And we should hear the signal and try and respond constructively to it. So, we'll see what happens with the new leadership in Alberta. There's always going to be stresses, and the next one will come from someone it's not even on our radar right now, but there will be continued stresses if we don't try to come to grips with these challenges.
So I would ask panel members in the time that we have left to get into a bit more of a discussion about what you would see as productive ways of addressing, on the one hand, the frustration that perhaps the referendum displays on the part of voters, and on the other hand, the problem you've identified of constitutional inflexibility. How do we move past this situation of not being happy with where we are, but not seeming to be able to find a way to move forward? Gordon, do you want to start us off on that discussion?
Well, I think we have to be far more aggressive, and I think the federal government's got to be far more open to change. I think we have to do more to hold politicians to account for what they say they're doing and what they're not doing. I think that's important. But I'm going to step further a little back. This is one of my favorite quotes, and that is, the dogma of the quiet past is inadequate for the stormy present. The occasion is piled high with difficulty. We must rise to the occasion. We must think anew, and we must act anew. We must disenthrall ourselves, and then we will save our country. Now, the author was a pretty smart guy. His name was Abraham Lincoln in 1862, right? But the principle, I think, applies. Even in the discussion paper we had earlier, there was talk about orthodoxy. There is an orthodoxy. There is we can't change this attitude. And I think that's the danger. I think the opportunity is to say we can change it. How do we change it? We engage municipalities. Until the last 30 years, we hardly ever talked about First Nations governance even. We have 3 territories that we have to include in this. If we want Canada to be united, we have to unite Canadians, and we have to find a common language, common goals, and common objectives, and not protect our, quotes, power, right? We have to give it back to people in a way that will be constructive and useful and unifying. So I think we have to eliminate we can't talk about the Constitution. I think we should put it back on the table and say what will make a Constitution work. And I agree that is partially idealistic, but I also know that if you don't set some goals for yourself and say, let's have this discussion and let's listen listen to the answers and learn from the answers and make changes, then I think we're going to see a constant pressure, and that pressure cooker is going to do something somewhere, somehow. I can't predict what it will be. I do know people need to be engaged. I do know people need to be, heard, not just, left aside. I can read just a few months ago, I was in Ontario and someone told me, well, nothing happens in Canada if it's not in Toronto. There is an attitude there that says that. And there's a whole bunch of Canada that's not in Toronto, like most of it, right? So we have to be reflective of that and think, what would the Constitution look like in the 21st century? I think it starts with subsidiarity. It starts with recognizing where people live, and it starts with recognizing how you deliver services to people, not to units, not to labels, but to people. And I think that would be at least an engaging conversation, and maybe would lead to some new plans and new opportunities in the future.
Andrew, your thoughts?
Well, Gord says we shouldn't be afraid to touch the Constitution. I touched it once as an academic around Meach, where there were provisions around the spending power, and I touched it again, I guess, as a minister around Charlottetown, and the fingers are still a little singed. Yeah. Having said that, I completely agree with Gordon that that it would be highly beneficial, and I have huge faith in leadership when it exists. I don't think it exists right now, but if there were the kind of Abraham Lincoln-like leadership at the national level, and perhaps at a few at the regional level as well, things can start to happen. Things can start to move. So I love the notion that there'd be some kind of grand bargain. I do think it would require some transference of jurisdiction in numbers of different directions, maybe involving municipalities too, and maybe recognize even more fully what's, I think, has de facto right now, some of the moves that have taken place around First Nations governance, which have come out of the constitutional amendments that were enacted previously. I'm not optimistic. I mean, the Constitution's become less flexible since Meach and Charlottetown. De facto, provinces have required referenda. In some cases, the federal government's committed to not go ahead with certain constitutional amendments unless other provinces are brought on board. So I'm not optimistic, but I love the notion of there being some kind of grand bargain. And I agree that political leadership can be transformative. I just don't see it right now. The alternative, it seems to me, which is a very much second or third best alternative, is to get some kind of administrative agreements, a la the social union framework agreement, where there's an agreement amongst the federal and provincial governments that the federal government won't move in certain areas without some level of provincial support, maybe allowing opting out, although I do worry about asymmetrical federalism. It can be quite destructive as well, but some level of opting out for provinces that don't want to go along, and try to deal with it in a more orderly and systematic way now. So at least there's some measure of accountability for when sending can take place and when it can't. But that's very much a second best option in my view.
Howard?
I think the second best option is the best option right now. And speaking from a little experience, I don't think I'm disclosing anything I can't say. COVID got in the way of a lot of things in everybody's lives, far more important than what I'm going to talk about. But it certainly got in the way of a lot of things that were priorities before COVID. And one of those for Alberta and for the Kenney government was really reaching out to Quebec and trying to make common cause in the way that Alberta and Quebec have in the past on issues that we agree on. The two provinces that are usually the most jealous in guarding their provincial jurisdiction. So going back to Leveque and Lougheed, I think there was opportunity for Kenney and Legault to play a similar role. I don't think it would have involved reopening the Constitution, just because post Meach and Charlottetown, what Quebec calls its revendications traditionnelles, its traditional demands, are just not going to be met right now. But something like a sub-constitutional accord that dealt with the spending power specifically, I think was, and based on my conversations with my counterparts in the Quebec government, was definitely of strong interest to them. But it wasn't quite a priority for them. Quebec was dealing with all sorts of its own domestic cultural issues. I actually remember meeting, and I can talk about this because Premier Keynes talked about it publicly. He was meeting with Premier Legault in Legault's office there in Quebec, around Duplessis' desk, and Premier Kennedy suggested to Legault, like, look, let's find the issues that we agree on. We have probably 7 premiers that will agree with us at this point. Let's talk about tax point transfers or getting rid of the spending power in some way. This has always been a traditional demand of Quebec. Alberta is absolutely on board. We can go to the Council of the Federation, probably get, if not unanimity, pretty close to it. And Legault's response was, look, I agree with you in principle. It's just not a priority right now. And Premier, why would I do this? And Premier Kennedy said, well, because then you could have more control over your jurisdiction. You could get the money, but federal government wouldn't tell you what to do. And Legault looked over and said, Ottawa's not going to tell me what to do. And that's the asymmetrical federalism. Ottawa's not going to tell Quebec what to do, but they're still quite happy to tell Alberta what to do. And I think the way of getting rid of asymmetrical federalism is giving everybody the opt-out, which is essentially getting rid of strings on federal transfers. And I think there's a way that the provinces could get together, particularly this Legault government, which is a very practical government, very pragmatic government, certainly the government that's easiest to deal with in recent Quebec history. And I think there would be a possibility of getting something closer to the social union framework with Quebec on board than there would have been any time in the last decade.
Just further to that, before you go to Gordon, there was in 1998 a provincial consensus document that was developed at the provincial table for bargaining purposes with the Social Union Framework Agreement that had Quebec, BC, Alberta, all, I think Quebec more in acquiescence than formal agreement, but certainly by and large an agreement that could have formed the basis for exactly that kind of arrangement. It was scuppered with the help of Saskatchewan by the then federal government and by Prime Minister Chrétien for all the reasons that we might expect, and scuppered in the way I described earlier by exercising even more spending power. But it does suggest that these things can be done, and if taken to the next step, could have produced an administrative arrangement that would have at least gone some way to address the issues we talked about.
And I suppose part of the frustration that people have with administrative arrangements is just how long do they last? I can remember the British Columbia reference on the Canada Assistance Plan. Andrew, you may, this is going back quite a ways, the British Columbia Court of Appeal was kind of attracted to the argument that there was a legitimate expectation that the Canada Assistance Plan wouldn't be changed when a new government came in on that government's whim, and that they would follow the process that had been put forward by the previous government. And the Supreme Court of Canada said, no, parliamentary sovereignty. That was the old government's deal. This is a new government. They can do whatever they want. And so it of course, could be that people would, if you have enough inertia from administrative agreements, maybe they start to develop a life of their own. But you can imagine why people might be a bit gun shy.
But you're attaching them to a power that is itself very subject to exactly that same thing. I mean, Paul Martin's budget cuts in 1995, which decimated provincial budgets across the country, I mean, was done without any provincial consultation and was done without much political cost, because it was done behind the spending power where people really couldn't relate to it or see it. But it had huge consequences on the province's fiscal capacities in respect of a whole range of things, but particularly healthcare.
Yeah. Gordon,
any last words from you?
My last comment is that I agree with what Andrew and Howard are saying, but I think we can agree ourselves to oblivion is the problem. and you know, the challenge that we have is, you know, frankly, the federal government is not in any way sort of engaged with moving this forward. So we have to find a way we get citizens engaged first, because it's in their interest. I think that's going to be a critical component of this. And, I can't help but go back when we talk about, I think I mentioned this before, but we go back to the federal provincial meetings and we'll sit down and we'll get this thing together. The feds will go off and do what they want, which is exactly what Paul Martin did when he balanced the budget in 1995. Or the feds and the provinces will say, we are totally united behind this. We're going to do this. It's for Canada, like they did with the interprovincial trade barriers in 1992, which still exist.
Right.
So it's the top priority for the day that they have the meeting, and then it becomes another thing, right? So we have to find a way that we re-engage people in this discussion about strengthening the country and providing them with cost-effective responses for the services they want. Health's a very good example. Education's a good example. I think Andrew raises a very interesting point about advanced education and what we do with students. But we have to re-engage in that discussion with the public, because they're the ones that are paying this. They're the ones that are not getting the results that we need. And healthcare is the most glaring example, but there's lots of other examples that are sort of invisibly undermining the quality of life that we have in Canada, and we have to come to grips with it. So I think this has been a great conversation. I'm totally aware of the fact that Howard and Andrew are far more versed in the Constitution than I am, but I do think that we can do much better. Not this as a panel, but as a country, we can do much better. But it will take some people to sort of provoke, to poke the donkey a little bit and make sure that they know that, there is something we can do. We just have to start trying to do it. I'm glad to take any routes that we can to get to an improved situation for Canada. And I do think, sorry, go ahead, Andrew.
I was going to say, maybe we can take advantage of one of Gordon's most creative and best innovations of all, the Citizens Assembly, which was created in this province. The only thing I'd ask is that they have a lower threshold of approval in order to make sure that we can go ahead. But that Citizens Assembly might well do it. And Gordon, you're the auteur of the Citizens Assembly. So,
well, you could be poking me a little bit, but I'll tell you this: I think that would be a great initiative for the country.
No, I'm a big fan of the Citizens Assembly, just not the threshold.
Yeah, but I think the assembly itself would be a very positive way of engaging people across the country in this issue, because it is their issue, right? They're very busy doing other stuff. So you have to, one of the things that the Citizens Assembly did was it said to people, this is going to take work. This isn't about what you read in the newspaper last week. You're going to do some work. You're going to listen to people that really understand some of these issues, not the politicians per se, but let's go and see if we can do that. I do think that's an answer. Well, it's a step towards an answer, which would certainly engage people, I believe.
Howard, we'll give the last word to you.
Well, I'll borrow Gordon's words. I think we are agreeing ourselves into oblivion, which is at least marginally better than disagreeing ourselves into oblivion, which is the usual Canadian way when it comes to constitutional issues. So, baby steps.
Well, on behalf of the Center for Constitutional Studies, I want to thank our three panelists for what I at least found to be an extremely informative and interesting discussion. We weren't able to get to all of the questions that our audience put up on the board, but I think we did cover some of the most important ones. I also want to take this opportunity to say thank you to my friends and colleagues, Peter Gall and Ben Oliphant from Gall, Legg, Grant, and Zwack in Vancouver for their work in conceptualizing this panel and in recruiting the panelists and organizing our thoughts. Peter and Ben, really appreciate your efforts and initiative. Finally, I want to say thank you to Pat Parody and the staff of the Center for Constitutional Studies for putting this program together, and also to the members of the audience for attending. If you have friends who didn't get an opportunity to participate live, the center will be posting this conversation on its website and its YouTube site. So thank you once again to everyone, and good day.
Thanks everyone.
Take care, everybody.
And thank you, Phil.
You're welcome.